Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Justin Holmes, professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa, with the disclaimer that my views do not represent those necessarily of my employer, the state of Iowa, or our 24 million hogs. And I'm joined today by Joey Ashbrook, who is a conservative attorney involved in the conservative legal movement. Good morning, Joey. How you doing?
Doing great, Justin.
Hey, it's good to have you here. It's nice talking to you.
You too, pal.
All right, so we've got a lot going on. I feel like every time we put together a show list, it's like drinking from a fire hose. So trying to get to as much as we can in a day. So I think we're going to start with sort of what seems to be one of the big stories of the week, which is sort of the continuing series of developments as far as the Epstein scandal, as well as Trump's connection or lack thereof, as well as sort of resurfacing of Russia in 2016. So early in the week, we had Trump and Bondi threaten to indict Obama for interfering with the 2016 election and fabricating evidence of Russian meddling. This is around the same time that it was revealed that Pam Bondi had told Trump that his name pops up in the Epstein files. Of course, we don't know in what capacity, but that was a discussion had either in May or June, depending on which version of that story you believe. It's been reported as both. In the meantime, sort of other developments, a subcommittee of the House Oversight Committee finally did vote to subpoena the Epstein files. Was introduced by Summer Lee from Pennsylvania. 5 Dems and 3 Republicans voted for it, which makes a majority of that subcommittee, including Nancy Mace. So, again, we've had sort of a number of episodes here where we've not had Congress willing to subpoena the records. Here, perhaps they have. Thursday and Friday, Ghislaine Maxwell met with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche and supposedly gave him 100 names that were in the files. And this leads to sort of all kinds of questions. What's going to happen with this? Certain sort of pro-Trump media outlets, admittedly a little more off to the periphery, that started referring to her as a victim and floating the idea of her being pardoned. Yesterday, Trump was asked if he would pardon her and said, well, I haven't considered it, but it's something that I'm allowed to do, which seems to be sort of opening the door there, raising some questions about what's happening there. In the meantime, and I promise I'll, Joey, get to you in just a second, Fox released a poll showing that only 13% of respondents thought that Trump was being transparent about Epstein, and 67% thought that he was not, leaving 20% who were either undecided or had not heard about the issue and apparently are living under rocks. So, with all of that, Joey, where do you think this is going and sort of what is the fallout? We've got a lot of moving pieces here. This is a story that sort of keeps coming back, or at least has been around the periphery for a long time, but suddenly it's very central for the last couple of weeks, and seems to be a lot of action here. So what's your take on all of this?
Well, I understand why it's central for sure. I'm not sure in the end how much real legs in the long run the Epstein story is going to have. I think that the more consequential one is the Russia collusion, the Russiagate from 2016. But the Epstein file, I find it hard to believe. I will say that probably There have been a few news cycles that the president's outfit is probably not one on the Epstein files for sure. But I do think at the end of the day, I don't think that if there was ultimately something in the Epstein files credible that tied him to what folks on that don't like him would hope was the case, I find it really hard to believe that the previous administration would not have used that in the spate of trials and accusations that were levied against him to prevent him or ahead of the last election. So, as a practical matter, I don't think there's really anything there. I do think that you got a lot of people who interacted with a New York socialite over many decades. And you've got folks like President Clinton and who knows what any backstory there might be with him, that there's a lot of crossover. So there's natural embarrassment that people can jump on from past associations. But I think Trump kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago years ago, a couple decades ago. And I find it hard to believe that ultimately there's going to be there. So I think it's a short-term news cycle mover for the Dems. I'm not sure ultimately what kind of legs it will ultimately have in the long. Russia, though, to me, and I've always thought that the Russia gate was worse than Watergate. And so I have no problem with getting to the bottom of exactly what happened and having accountability. I think it's unlikely that President Obama is charged with anything, including because of the recent immunity decision from the Supreme Court. Now, there's an interesting wrinkle to that in that it doesn't apply to acts after someone leaves office. And these events happened at the very tail end of his last term. But I still think it's pretty unlikely that he ends up getting charged, although I'm not the one making decisions. It is possible that some of the lower people, depending on the truth of what went on, it's possible that they could be charged. I don't know exactly what the charge would be, but to me, the main thing is accountability. And the reason I think it was worse than Watergate was that in Watergate, one presidential campaign spied on another presidential campaign in an election where they ended up winning in a monumental landslide. And it unnecessarily, it was an ode to the desire for control from certain individuals who didn't even need it. In this case, if you have people who engage in organized deception to undermine a duly elected president of the United States, what they're really doing is undermining the fabric of our basic democracy, that the people who voted for something that was admittedly a surprise working against it to try to countermand what they did. And so there's a lot of rhetoric that can be employed about dragging the country through a real expensive ordeal for years and subverting the president. But on a fundamental level, it went against the will of the people in a way that has always bothered me. So I think accountability is good. I think getting to the bottom of it's good. And I think ultimately, if there's truth there, I think that's going to be a long lasting story for American history. And I don't think as people, we have to be afraid of truth anywhere. And on either side, sometimes it can be a little messy. Sometimes it can have some warts to it, but for a democracy to thrive, for our democratic republic to thrive, truth is important.
So, yeah, I think I'm going to agree with certain sentiments, disagree with certain sentiments, agree in part, dissent in part. So, I think maybe I start with where I agree. When I was on a couple weeks ago with, it was Trey and Mike, I think. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit when things in the Epstein world were, a little more low key than they are at the moment. And I think one thought that I have about all of this is, sort of a tempest in a teapot a little bit, in terms of political implications. He's a lame duck president, so it's not going to impact, getting reelected. At which point I don't really see a scenario where Trump, just assuming the worst, and again, we don't know what's in there. I don't really see a scenario where Trump gets indicted for anything, out of this or goes on trial or anything like that. So I'm not entirely sure, what the kind of long-term political consequence of this would be, just because there's not a whole lot there. It does seem to be sort of not helping his overall approval, although, frankly, Trump's approval I'll maybe come back to this a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be functioning in sort of the same way that approval traditionally has as a presidential resource. So I'm not even sure that matters too much. Oh, hell, we'll just go for it now. There's kind of a long literature in political science where, basically popular presidents get stuff done and unpopular presidents don't. And this is a pretty consistent finding. Richard Newstad was kind of one of the first people to kind of observe this, but it's pretty consistent. You want to be George Bush after 9/11 from a policy standpoint. You don't want to be George Bush in 2007 and 2008, where even your own party doesn't want to talk to you at that point. And so, the traditional view here is that, gosh, if you're under 50, and it's not a magic number, but it's a nice inflection point, you're going to have a hard time getting stuff done. And what we've seen here is that, Trump was, slightly above 50 when he comes into office, dips below. I've seen him polling, 36 to 40 in the last week. And that doesn't seem to be slowing him down any. So, in terms of sort of the ways that you would expect this to play out, obviously we don't have reelection issues. We don't have reelection issues. And frankly, kind of the approval as a resource isn't playing either. So I don't know, in reality, at least for the president, how much of a mess this is. The concern, I suppose, I would have if I were a Republican is, we are going into midterms, and we're going to talk a little bit more about midterms in a little bit, but we are headed to midterms. And certainly I think some of what the Democrats are doing here is sort of trying to get them on record as trying to get Republicans on record as not wanting to release the files, as carrying water for an unpopular president, et cetera. And so certainly I think this is something that we might see as a campaign issue in a couple of years. Well, gosh, a year, I guess, at this point. Whether it's got legs that long, I don't know. It's certainly something that I think is going to be part of the messaging. It's not anything that, whether people still care about this in a year, if they've moved on, that's kind of another question. As far as why it's not released before, I think it's an interesting point that, if there's something in there that's really damning, you would think that, more would have been made of it. On the other hand, if there's not something damning in there, not releasing the stuff certainly is a choice. If you have kind of stuff that you're not being transparent about, certainly people get upset about lack of transparency. And it does sort of make you wonder, well, what's in there that they're concerned is going to piss people off more than a lack of transparency. And, full disclosure, I have no idea, and I'm assuming you have no idea what's actually in there.
No clue.
As far as Trump goes, we've got some guilt by association sort of stuff. They clearly know each other. Certainly some gossipy kind of stuff indicates they were fairly tight, at one time. Some dispute over what the fallout was about why he got kicked out of Mar-a-Lago or if he left voluntarily. Anyway, again, these are things that it's sort of, it's hard to, and we just don't know. And, certainly there was a report that, Trump's name, Bondi says Trump's name comes up. Again, that could be any number of things. That could be anything from, these are people that knew each other to Trump did something really bad. And again, we don't know.
You've also got a guy who has lived in the tabloid socialite world for most of his life. And if you're talking about and understands what it's like to be accused of things that he didn't do, and if you talk about full releases of stuff where hundreds of names are mentioned that may not even have an issue, but to your point about association, guilt by association, I think that it might be an extremely honorable impulse to not destroy people that were not even really perpetrators of any wrong, just based off of voluminous release. So it might even be a particularly honorable impulse. And the release is more complicated because you've got aspects related to the dispute and testimony. You've got court imposed protections. And so some of what the Trump administration's been doing is trying to probe what can actually be done. but I do understand why. I think long term it's not going to have much legs. I think immediately the Democrats are going to try to use it as a campaign issue. I think it's interesting though, would say to their detriment that they talk a lot about, and they made a lot of hay on the big beautiful bill successfully, and some would argue, in public opinion polling, but pushing Epstein in the midterms, I think is somewhat of a tell that it's more likely than not the economy is going to be rip roaring rocking because of the smarts of the things that were done legislatively, structurally for our economy. And then, so what you do, if you don't have the substance, you got something else other than the substance. So I do think it could also potentially boomerang depending on how it's handled, but we'll see. Were you going to talk a little bit about the Russia gate?
Yeah, although I come back to what you said there, about the midterms. I mean, I think it's an open question where we'll be. We'll just leave it. I'm a little skeptical about a rip roaring economy in a year based on the big beautiful bill, but we'll see, of course, where that is. But it's pretty standard to pull scandals out.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's not an unusual thing. Whether it's a multi-pronged attack or not. We're going to talk in the bonus show some about the state of the Democratic Party, and as a little foreshadowing, I mean, this is sort of something that I think they have been balancing and not always well. I think the leadership has not been communicating in ways that are always effective, but they've been trying to kind of stay on message about, well, this is prices, et cetera, and all this other stuff's a distraction. I mean, I think that's sort of an open question there. What's the foreground and what's the distraction in these scenarios, and what kind of campaigns are they going to run? But I think, I'm a little skeptical this has a year worth of legs on it. To your point, I guess that was going to respond. I will talk a little bit about Russia. I'm not sure. I mean, if you really did pull everything out, I mean, on the one hand, you're naming names. On the other hand, it's not just a list. I mean, there's all kinds of testimony in there. So presumably, you would have, I mean, yes, you're going to have some guilt by association. On the other hand, a lot of those names are already out there, as sort of guilt by association. We had some flight logs years ago and things like that. And that's why, like, Bill Gates keeps getting thrown around and things like that. I do think that, if you were to kind of release this, certainly with redactions for victim protection and things, there's going to be various levels of culpability. I mean, it's pretty clear that Epstein was enabling some people to do shady things. And in other situations, he was just doing like weird philanthropy and stuff. He's just a strange guy in a lot of ways. Is what I keep coming back to. I mean, it's a series of weird fixations. As far as the Russiagate thing, I guess kind of back to that, I've yet to see particularly coherent sort of explanation of what it is that Obama allegedly did. As far as this goes, I mean, there's kind of, certainly the rounds of officials making the rounds of the press today or recently, there's a lot of insinuation of nefarious stuff, some of which were things that he didn't say, specifically. And I mean, we do have some, we have evidence of some Russian interference in that, certainly kind of the hacking of the Democratic Party and things like that, which, a congressional committee led by Marco Rubio at the time found credible evidence of. So, again, thinking about kind of going where evidence leads, I'm not sure, and I don't want to relitigate the impeachments at this point, but I have not seen anything that's convinced me that, whether you think the impeachment was a waste of time or not, and just given the math, it probably was. But, I've not seen much that explains to me what wrongdoing Obama was exactly involved in, or frankly, anybody else. I don't know. Should we perhaps move on?
Yeah, I think, that's fine.
Happy to get anything else in there? Okay.
No, and I think, the point you made at the end too about Epstein, about the weird eclecticness in the vast reach of his relationships across different contexts. Some were incredibly evil, and others were ostensibly interconnected, just socialite interconnected, I think is why, as a practical matter, even though I'm a big transparency guy in all things, I do fit into that camp. It's a very complicated dynamic that I don't have any beef with the president's impulses on that. And I think that his impulses might actually be honorable, but on some level, why even go down the road of fighting the game of making all those arguments? Because there's no way you're going to get a fair take on it. So I think they're playing it right. And I think the more important story is Russia and Obama. It may not, I think Obama, big names obviously get big attention, and that's important. But the ultimate importance is the underlings that are still high up in the government and the truth about their actions.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
Let's go ahead and move on. Or segment 2, Justin, the kerfluffle, the CBS kerfluffle. Colbert is no more. And then a lot of things happened in the last week and a half. Colbert is no more. The 60-minute suit with Trump has been settled. The merger between Paramount and Skydance was approved on Thursday. And there was a promise to police CBS by the merging acquirer to police CBS News for bias and to prevent any new DEI programs at CBS. Progress or freedom of the press? What say you?
Oh, you know where I'm coming with this. I think there's huge press freedom issues here. This. I think the only good fallout of this is that we finally got a pretty good South Park episode, out of the deal. Although things that I cannot unsee. So, this whole thing to me has been pretty problematic. With the caveat that, there are some things that frankly are kind of ambiguous, as far as what's gone down there. So, just to go back to kind of the beginning of this, I frankly thought that Trump's initial lawsuit was pretty much nonsense and more or less a shakedown. Whether or not CBS, edited the Harris interviews in ways that are unfair, which was essentially his allegation. It's not clear to me. Clearly he's bringing this as a civil suit, but it's not at all clear to me what his damage is here exactly. Vis-a-vis news, they have the right to make editorial decisions. They have the right to ask particular questions. They edit things, et cetera, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But at the end of the day, this really didn't seem, it's not like it was a case of libel or something like that, which frankly, against politicians is quite hard to prove as well. We have a pretty long history of more or less exempting them, from being able to successfully litigate those claims. So to me, this whole thing was suspicious. Now, again, whether or not this is sort of a shakedown as certain, folks have spun it, I don't know. Trump just is in general extraordinarily litigious and, he's just throwing stuff at the wall. But certainly the timing here is suspicious. So, they settle, he gets money, lawsuit drops, and 2 days later, the merger's approved. Definite conflict of interest vibes here at a minimum and, arguably potentially more. The Colbert thing, that is hard to say, honestly. Again, the timing is tremendously suspect. It's, just a day or two after Colbert calls out CBS for paying a bribe, as he describes it. Now, again, certainly this is kind of thing that I think Trump would probably like to see go away. On the other hand, I mean, Letterman used to poke fun at GE for years and they let him get away with it. But, pissing off the management isn't always ideal. But it also, again, the timing here right around the approval of the deal is iffy. On the other hand, I mean, late night in general is not a particularly profitable thing. So, although the weird thing about all of this, whether it's a story of late night being, losing money or being about the merger, hey, we're going to fire you in a year, is a weird answer to either of those questions, honestly, which is kind of odd. I will say the stuff that really makes me sort of worried here that I think is problematic is this ombudsman thing that sort of popped up yesterday where, essentially there's an ombud, according to Gizmodo, CBS's news is going to have an ombudsman installed who's more or less answerable to the White House, which frankly, combined with some things that FCC Chairman Carr said about, well, news needs a course correction, I think these are really problematic in terms of press freedom. There is a lot of problems with how, and I think you and I would disagree about which outlets, but I think there's a lot of problems with how the press covers politics. But a pretty basic First Amendment thing here is that, look, this freedom of the press is particularly for protecting, freedom from government interference, allowing the ability to report, accurately or report what they believe, as far as politics goes. And this really seems to have sort of a chilling effect. And I think at CBS, this is problematic. Where I'm maybe a little less concerned in a way is sort of twofold. I mean, one, and I've kind of said this before, Jay and I used to go back and forth on this a little bit. I'm not sure at this point who really cares about legacy media in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. The audience, because Jay was always, I basically say, well, you've got a whole conservative news universe, what does it matter at this point, if you're on the big three? And he was pretty adamant that, well, we still should be treated better by those guys. But in a world where, essentially you do have a multitude of outlets, I think at this point, I don't know how important CBS is anymore, or NBC or ABC. I'm always mystified when I see like ads for their shows. It's like, what the hell are these things that I've never heard of? So, frankly, the fact that there's that much money in this merger is sort of surprising as much as anything. But I'm not sure that maybe the political consequence is quite as big as the gloom and doom folks have argued. I think the interference is bad. I think it sets a bad precedent. I think, this ombudsman thing appointed by the federal government is just completely wrong on First Amendment grounds. On the other hand, I'm not sure how important CBS News is anymore. And frankly, as we've seen with the Washington Post lately, they're hemorrhaging reporters. That's a slightly different scenario, but Jeff Bezos, completely within his rights, has made decisions about what the editorial stance is going to be, and everybody's leaving. At which point, if I'm not sure, who's going to keep reading the Post at this point. I kind of feel the same way about CBS. I mean, at some point, if they start hemorrhaging talent, the market may take care of it itself. So, I have some pretty serious concerns here, but I'm not sure, at least for the sake of CBS, I'm not sure how much consequence there is, even if sort of the worst happens. Your thoughts?
I think it's progress. I think it's a great thing. The network should take its medicine and do its job the way it's supposed to do its job. I think that is the path here. Look, pride is a biz niche. And sometimes we get stuck in our own pride rather than taking an exit ramp that's positive, that's going to be good for us in the long run. And this issue is at the central core of what got Donald Trump elected in 2016. And part of what carried him all the way to one of the most extraordinary comeback wins in 2024 in the history of American politics that was tried in the court of public opinion by the jury of American voters, and whether or not they think that legacy media and big media is doing its job as a nonpartisan actor that's just giving us the news, or whether it is itself an actor trying to push its own agenda of what it wants to have happen. And I think that resoundingly, the American people do not believe it's just reporting facts and calling balls and strikes. And I think that this is an opportunity, although I can understand no one ever likes the idea of someone telling them to do that. And the idea of, well, we didn't beat Trump, we lost to Trump. I would say it was really just the American people to take the exit ramp and get back to the basics of journalism, of reporting the facts in the way that is just reporting the facts. I think that is ultimately the way to have a point of differentiation in our hyperpolarized culture today that's going to be good for business and is what they're supposed to do. And as a formal matter, I think the difference with the CBSs and the ABCs and the NBCs is that they're on the public airwaves. So I agree with you that they're not, how important are they really? And yes, we have partisan news, like we have news organizations that cater more towards editorial views that cater more towards certain partisans that have blown up just in the American experience of creating your own channel for distribution of information out. We're always evolving. We're always changing. They're still on the public airwaves. So they should, as a matter of the way they approach, be as even-handed as possible. So I think it's progress. It's consistent. It's just a natural, taking actual action related to one of the meta questions that was teed up starting in 2016 for decision by the American people that I think has been resoundingly decided. And while I understand people getting their dander up in pride, I think the smart play, the wise play, is to take the exit ramp and just get back to the joy of journalism, of telling the story where it leads. And I know that people would say, well, that's what we always do, but it's more complicated than that. And I think people need to be honest with themselves about their priors and what they're doing. And I think that would be my advice to CBS. And the Colbert, I think that, well, I know that the late night shows were very different. This isn't your grandpa's CBS. This isn't even your father's CBS or NBC. And even the late night shows are very different than they used to be from the Johnny Carson day and the conversational unpacking and getting to accessibility to the stars and unpacking what's going on with people. There's definitely a tinge of normative, what do you care about, opinion-based editorial journalism that is going on infused with those. And I know that was a main emphasis of the whole Obama era, was we need to operationalize every sphere of society to push our views. But one of the downsides of that is America loses bipartisan spaces that have nothing to do with politics, that gives us an opportunity to come together, even if we strongly disagree, and not even think about politics for a minute. Sports being another great example. News is an example of that. Entertainment is an example of that. And when everything becomes weaponized about what's good and what's evil, and what's good is defined by what I believe politically, and what's evil is what you believe politically, then it hurts our ability as Americans to live our shared identity as a nation in ways where we don't have to disagree all the time. So I think it's progress. I think it's really healthy. And if media on some level is able to return to more of a true journalism of just reporting the facts, and then let the politicians argue about who's right and who's wrong, if we can accomplish some of that, then that's colossal progress. So I think this is progress.
I guess I just don't see this as a path to progress myself. I mean, I think that's a laudable goal, but I think two things I would push back against. Three. On the late night thing, I mean, we've certainly had late night, going after, talking politics for ages. Yeah, admittedly, Colbert is a different take on that, but I mean, Jay Leno somewhere is in a casino telling Monica Lewinsky jokes right now or tonight, someplace. I don't know that that's necessarily new, But as far as kind of the legacy news goes, it's not clear to me that they were disproportionately hard on Trump. I mean, there are any number of instances, frankly, economic coverage, for example, during kind of the last year of the Biden presidency, where, I think if anything, they pushed kind of in the wrong direction. I mean, you have, it's all of this inflation, scaremongering when inflation has gone back to basically normal, at the end. Now, again, but, it's not at all clear to me that Trump got a particularly unfair shake. I mean, there's a lot of criticism to go around. But even if we were to stipulate sort of all of that, I think this government intervention is absolutely not the way to go in terms of this ombudsman business. That's not who's the arbiter. That's not who gets to decide. We do have, kind of a long history of, you're absolutely right. There is a distinction between being on the airwaves and being on the internet and being on cable. And certainly we have accepted certain restrictions on broadcast stuff. There are certain words that you can't say. One of my favorite words, you can't say on broadcast TV. I even refrain from saying it here for the sake of being kind. But, you don't do nudity, et cetera. We have some standards there. But, we had kind of the last vestiges of sort of any kind of political content stuff in terms of regulation would have been the Fairness Doctrine, which has been gone since the 80s, that basically called for equal time. And I actually think that, I think some, because it was Reagan that ended that, you had some Democrats that have pushed back. And I've argued actually for a long time that, I'm not sure there's ever a sensible way to sort of do the Fairness Doctrine. But in a world what we have now where, there are so many sources, I don't know that it makes any sense, and certainly getting rid of that Fairness Doctrine certainly has changed radio, in particular. But, that the conservative position was that, hey, that's a bad idea. But, that, hey, government shouldn't be sort of regulating political content that way. But this strikes me, having somebody kind of inside where the administration decides what's fair in terms of coverage is a massive conflict of interest. And just, regardless of what the network had been doing, is not, to my mind, an appropriate response.
At the end of the day, it is the single most important issue that has been tried in the court public opinion, and being that legacy media, which I agree is increasingly irrelevant, is biased as opposed to doing just a balls and strikes job, even if you disagree with them. And because they're on the public airwaves, there's certainly a public right to want to have journalism be journalism, which I think would be good for our country. So I think what's being done there is certainly progress.
All right. Well, we've got time for, I think, about one more topic. If we're ready to move on, I feel like we probably both said our piece there, more or less. So this last thing here is potential redistricting ahead of the midterms. So if we kind of look at our history and kind of one of our constitutional features, et cetera, we have sort of built into the Constitution a requirement to do a census every decade, whose purpose really initially and still sort of main purpose is to figure out how many people live where so that we can divvy up seats in the House of Representatives, since those are apportioned by population rather than state equality like the Senate. And traditionally what we've done here is that, every 10 years we have a census. And once those numbers comes in, the states, according to their own methods, and essentially this is left to the states with some federal guardrails, but been left to the states to essentially determine what their congressional districts look like. The couple sort of standards at the federal level, basically one, that they need to be roughly equal in population, and two, generally speaking, you can't disenfranchise racial minorities through districting process. But beyond that, pretty much anything goes as far as sort of what process you use and ultimately, how you draw those boundaries. In particular, there's sort of this question, and I think it's unpopular with a lot of Americans that, we gerrymander, that, we drive districts, for political purposes in a lot of states. Not mine, I might add. Iowa's one that I think sort of gets it right in terms of the process. But, to give a little sense of this, gerrymandering, a lot of people don't like it. On the other hand, it's named after Elbridge Gerry, who signed the Declaration of Independence. So, this is something that goes back to essentially the founding.
Yeah. Oldest time.
Oldest time. So the question sort of before us, though, is that Texas is now looking to call a special session to essentially redistrict after they just redistricted. And apparently Governor Abbott was kind of resistant to this, but Trump pushed him and now he's changed his tune, essentially with the goal of sort of redistricting in a way to shore up and Republican majorities in the House, essentially by creating sort of more safe Republican districts in Texas. Texas is a state that certainly leans red at state level, but there are a lot of Democrats there too. And certainly there are Democratic representatives from Texas. What we hopefully know from gerrymandering is that, how you draw the districts matters, where people are grouped matter, et cetera. So kind of the question here, is this midterm thing. This isn't the first time that Texas has done this, actually. I believe it was right about 20 years ago that there was a big blow up over this because nobody was really doing this. And then Texas decided to do it for much the same reasons. Democrats skipped the state. They actually all fled to Oklahoma to try to deny Republicans a quorum. And then there was a whole state police searching Oklahoma for Democrats and, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately that was upheld. It says, you have to do a redistricting every 10 years. Nothing that says you can't do it more often than that. This has sort of led to some calls for, Democrats to try to do a midterm redistricting in California, although there's some state law that I think would make that sort of difficult, or perhaps other places in sort of a tit for tat sort of thing, all of which, frankly, even, what are we, 13, 14 months out from 15 months out from an election, it certainly throws a lot of things into play. So anyway, that's a rambling backstory. Joey, what are your thoughts on this?
First, that it's not remotely surprising, as you said, you said in the intro, how redistricting or gerrymandering is as old as time in the American experience. And the jockeying over redistricting and the way apportionment works is something that's a constant, ongoing, fluid situation. And so in this particular case, I don't find it surprising in the least, but I'm taking it that you take umbrage with it. So what's your take on that? Why do you take umbrage with it?
Well, I don't know that I do in certain ways. As a general principle, I do have some problems, with it. Even, I guess my general position is even if something's old as time, doesn't mean it's good necessarily. And, I think, this, if we're thinking about kind of broad democratic potential here, one of the real concerns that I have anymore is that, we have, in admittedly a bipartisan way, drawn up a Congress and a bunch of state legislatures with very, very few competitive districts. And, at the heart of democracy is, having a meaningful choice. And so, obviously there are districts because people are, we have geographic differences in how people vote. You're going to get some that are naturally lopsided. So, for example, here in Iowa, we've got 4 congressional districts. The Northwest one, as I mentioned, we have a nonpartisan process for doing it. We have 3 pretty competitive districts and one that's absolutely not, but it is entirely rural. And, there is no 4th district of Iowa that you're going to draw that's competitive. That's just how it goes. But I think, when we pull sort of the, if you look at like the Cook Political Report and stuff, when they rate competitiveness, when you have 435 House seats and there are like 50 in play, I think that's a big problem. Now, again, you're not going to get 435 in play in a two-party system, but I do think that you have, even if this is old as time, I think it's a feature I don't particularly like. That said, I mean, this Texas thing, I mean, it is what it is. You get to redistrict, and the courts basically held, hey, you can redistrict whenever. So, uh, I don't have any specific objection to this necessarily, beyond just sort of a bigger objection to gerrymandering in general. But the courts keep shooting down attempts to rein that in, at least at the national level. So go ahead.
One thing that I think, though, that's funny, separating, there's the what I stand for politically and what I view, and then just taking a step back in the horse race aspects of politics and just looking at it and finding certain things interesting or amusing. A lot of the arguments. So this actually, if they do redistrict it could work against the Republicans in Texas in the immediate.
Yeah, I was going to make that point, but go ahead.
Yeah, it really could. But the reason it could is because in order to do what they would want to do to give them the best chance possible to squeeze more GOP seats of the state of Texas, you have to spread the vote a little thinner. So you're going to have fewer 70-30 districts, and you're going to have more 55-45. 53-47 districts. And that means during certain elections, depending on turnout and shifting demographics and shifting population centers, you put seats in play that were not in play before. So what I find ironic is I'm living in Ohio, and there's been a redistricting fight forever for the last, I don't know, decade, darn near, over Ohio's districting. And one of the main arguments on the other side, from the way I view things, is, well, we need to spread the vote around a little bit. So then it's an argument against gerrymandering of safe districts to make every district more competitive. And so it's extremely ironic. If they did this, the potential boomerang risk is it makes districts more competitive, which I think
there's a part of me that's
funny. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm trying to think now which fable it is. I don't know. At any rate, but there's part that's kind of like Brer Rabbit in the Briar Patch. Don't throw me in the Briar Patch. It very much to me. I mean, this has a strong potential to backfire. I think you're right. And where those numbers are, I mean, there's a lot. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it depends on where people are moving and shifting demographics and things. But yeah, I mean, the basic to kind of reiterate what you said a minute ago. I mean, the basic principle of gerrymandering is that you make, for your opponents, you make really lopsided safe districts, and then you make slightly lopsided or moderately lopsided districts for yourself, and you can make a bunch of them, so you put together a bunch of 80-20 Democratic districts in Houston or whatever, and that gives you a bunch of safe 55-45s or whatever. But yeah, your point is absolutely right, and it's kind of like, well, go ahead and do it on some level. Now it depends what happens in the election, but we saw this, I mean, honestly, actually, after that Texas thing, I don't know how Texas played, but there was a sense in like 2006 and 2008 where you had these kind of, blue wave congressional elections. There was a sense that they were made worse by some of the Republican gerrymanders, because by, spreading those a little thinner, something that's a safe district in an environment where it's, an even congressional vote or, a slight Republican edge. If you have a Democratic, +6 kind of year and you have a bunch of Republican +3 districts, oops, it's so, and it's hard to know. I mean, we've gotten, actually, one of the things that bothers me with gerrymandering a little bit is they've gotten so good at it. We have such, I think, I can't say that I know a whole lot about Elbridge Gerry, but he's kind of shooting in the dark. He didn't have GIS and whatnot. So, but you run the risk now that we're so good at it, it works until the context changes, at which point, oops,
Well, yeah, I think another thing that's funny about it is it's as if, I mean, obviously in politics, pound the table, but it's as if the Dems haven't been good at this concept for a long time. One thing I find funny or amusing about, if you follow the story and the way it works, is the Texas Dems are flying to Illinois and California and talking with New York about let's fight fire with fire and let's squeeze more votes out of these states. And there's a dynamic with the independent commissions and some of them. But I think the real punchline is with a caution when you read the stories that people are like, well, actually, we've kind of already squeezed all the juice we can out of this orange. There's really not much more we can do in squeezing the votes out because we've been great at it forever. And I'm tipping my cap to them. They've been great at it forever. But for that point, though, you have to view like I do, independent commissions are generally favorable for the liberal Democrat view of things and tend to agree with what they want. And so they're a 1 degree removed way to get what they want without saying we're just forcing what we want. And I think that's a lot of the impulse in Ohio to try to get more Democrats squeezed out of Ohio and in the legislature by the use of independent commissions, et cetera, because the legislature is controlled by Republicans. But I think that it's as old as time. Our entire political experience is political and the states get to make decisions. And if you think that an important part of the immigration issue over the last 4 years of the Biden years, part of it, I mean, it depends on what you think, either for folks from my side, part of it's probably, people, I mean, a lot of what's argued is they're trying to destroy our country. I think there's probably some people who don't like our country. There are other people who they're smart enough to know that population centers impact apportionment numbers related to the census for house apportionment. And so if you've got sanctuary cities and you have concentrations of human beings and you have higher numbers of people, that helps with apportionment dynamics related to political power if you just have a cynical political view. So there's the very sophisticated efforts that are done for the ultimate dynamic of who has the votes and who has the power. And it's a political game that operates also at the state level, and states get to decide their districts. So on some level, it's old as time, and it's not surprising, and everybody does it in sophisticated ways. So, and it may be successful. It may boomerang. I know for me, I hope the Republicans have control. I sure hope Texas Tech hope Republicans have control of the House in 26.
Well, I would dispute that, but yeah, you're entitled to your opinion on that.
100%.
100%. But yeah, I mean, I think, given the state of the world and the state of play, I mean, the Supreme Court refuses to take this up, as a general matter, again, I just like to see more competitive elections. I think we have a real problem where, there is not sort of a meaningful competition in so many seats. That said, yeah, I mean, state of play, gosh, I'm all for Democrats, gerrymandering the bejesus out of Illinois too, at this point. I mean, you don't fight, tie a hand behind your back, and sort of unilaterally disarm. So, I think ultimately we'll have to see how this plays out, but I have a suspicion that this may actually backfire. So anyway, with go right ahead.
I think if you like competitive districts, what Texas is talking about doing by just as a matter of pure math will make this
actually is good. Yeah, I mean,
yes.
So I'm actually not necessarily opposed because I think as much as Democrats have been sort of salivating at the idea of a blue Texas for 2 decades now, whenever it was that the emerging Democratic majority came out, was that 2004? Anyway, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, blue Texas, again and again, seems to break Democrats' hearts. But yeah, I mean, I think this actually, I tend to agree. I mean, I think the most likely outcome here is a more competitive Texas rather than a less, even if that's not the motive. So anyway, with that, gosh, that brings us to about the end of the show. So Joey, it was great talking to you. And so, if there's anything we discussed in this episode that you disagreed with or that you have questions about, or gosh, if you really like, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. And you can also reach us through Facebook or X. We've got links in the show notes for that. We also have a Discord discussion forum for supporters, which Mike is on all the time. And I have actually just joined, although I haven't participated much, because gosh, I need more places online to squander my time. So anyway, I'm looking forward to being distracted there. As a supporter, you will get ad-free versions of everything that we release, the full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, access to the Discord group, which is a great discussion, I might add, where you can interact with me, Mike, Trey, and various other listeners. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. If a monthly Patreon contribution is too much of a commitment, or if you've got issues with Patreon for some reason, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, then we certainly wouldn't turn that down. We also have PayPal and Venmo support options as well. You can find the links to all of our support options at politicsguys.com/support, as well as in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full week episodes but are not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, which we understand, just email Mike at politicsguys.com and he'll be happy to get that set up for you. Whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as share episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Mataza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode next week, as well as a midweek show coming up soon, and we hope that you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,